Montana Territory, 1876. The spring wind carried the scent of wildflowers across the rolling grasslands, but for Elijah Quinn, the beauty of the frontier meant nothing but survival. At 26, he'd already seen enough death to last several lifetimes. The war between the states had taken his father and brother, and the unforgiving wilderness had claimed many friends since. His handsome face, usually set in stoic lines beneath the brim of his worn Stetson, rarely broke into a smile these days. "No room for sentiment out here," Elijah muttered to himself as he guided his chestnut mare along the winding creek. His lean, muscular frame shifted easily with the horse's movements, the result of years spent in the saddle. A light stubble shadowed his strong jawline, and his deep blue eyes constantly scanned the horizon, a habit born from necessity in a land where danger lurked behind every ridge. The cattle drive had finished early, and Elijah had parted ways with the other drovers in Miles City. The pay in his pocket meant nothing without purpose, and purpose was something he'd lost years ago. All he knew was the rhythm of the trail, the predictability of cattle, and the cold comfort of solitude. The frontier had taught him that attachment only led to loss. Better to wander alone than to build something only to watch it crumble. As the sun dipped toward the western mountains, Elijah spotted thin wisps of smoke rising from a homestead nestled in a protected valley. Normally, he would have given such a place wide berth. Other people's troubles weren't his concern, but something drew him closer. Perhaps it was the awkward angle of the front door, hanging partially off its hinges, or the unnatural quiet surrounding the modest cabin. Approaching cautiously, his hand resting near the Colt revolver on his hip, Elijah dismounted and tied his horse to a hitching post. The small farm appeared well tended despite obvious signs of struggle. A vegetable garden meticulously planted in neat rows stretched behind the cabin. A few chickens pecked nervously in their pen, but the front window was shattered and what looked like fresh blood stained the porch steps. "Hello," he called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "Anyone here need help?" A soft sound from within the cabin caught his attention, the unmistakable sound of someone trying to silence their sobs. Elijah drew his revolver and approached cautiously. "I mean no harm," he called. "I'm just passing through." When no answer came, he nudged the broken door open with his boot. The interior was in disarray, furniture overturned, dishes shattered on the floor. And there, huddled in the corner with a kitchen knife clutched in trembling hands, sat a young woman with tears streaming down her face. "Stay back," she warned, her voice breaking despite her obvious attempt at bravery. Elijah holstered his weapon slowly. "I'm not here to hurt you, ma'am." The woman couldn't have been more than 22, with golden blonde hair falling in disarray around a face that, despite the fear and tear stains, possessed a striking beauty. Her blue dress was torn at the sleeve and a bruise was forming on her delicate jawline. "What happened here?" he asked, keeping his distance. "They killed him," she whispered, lowering the knife slightly. "My husband. They killed Charles and took everything we had." Fresh tears spilled over. "I begged them not to, but they just laughed." Something stirred in Elijah's chest, an emotion he'd long thought buried beneath years of callousness. Compassion, perhaps. Or rage at the injustice. Either way, it unsettled him. "When?" he asked simply. "This morning, 3 men, they—" She broke off, unable to continue. Elijah noticed a framed photograph on the floor amid the wreckage. He picked it up carefully, a wedding portrait showing the young woman beside a smiling man perhaps a decade her senior. "You're alone now?" he asked, though the answer was obvious. She nodded, wiping tears with the back of her hand. "I'm Victoria Thornton, and I have nowhere to go." "Elijah Quinn," he offered in return, scanning the room. "These men. Would you recognize them if you saw them again?" Victoria nodded, her green eyes hardening with a resolve that seemed at odds with her fragile appearance. "I'll never forget their faces. Especially the one with the scar across his cheek." The description triggered a memory. Elijah had seen such a man in Miles City just 2 days prior, a known troublemaker named Hayes who ran with a small gang of thieves. They preyed on isolated homesteads, knowing the law was spread too thin to offer much protection. "Mrs. Thornton," Elijah said, making a decision that contradicted everything he believed about staying uninvolved, "gather whatever you can carry. You can't stay here alone." "Where would I go?" she asked, her voice hollow. Everything we had is gone. I have no family, no money. Elijah extended his hand toward her, a gesture so foreign to him that it felt like it belonged to another man entirely. For now, you'll come with me, we'll get you somewhere safe, and then I'll handle the men who did this. Victoria stared at his outstretched hand with distrust born of fresh trauma. Why would you help me? You don't know me. The question struck at the heart of Elijah's confusion. Why indeed? Every instinct honed by years on the frontier told him to walk away, to leave her to her fate as he had left so many others to theirs. Attachment was weakness. Involvement brought pain, yet something in her eyes, not just the fear or grief but a flickering resilience, made him stay. Because, he said finally, out here sometimes all we have is the decency we show one another. Victoria's expression changed, hope cautiously emerging through her despair. Slowly she placed her small hand in his calloused one and allowed him to help her to her feet. I need to bury him, she said softly. I can't leave Charles like this. Elijah nodded solemnly. We'll do that first, then we go. As the sun set over the Montana hills, Elijah dug a grave behind the cabin while Victoria gathered what few possessions she could salvage. Together they laid her husband to rest, Victoria's tears falling silently as Elijah awkwardly recited what he could remember of the Lord's Prayer. When the last shovelful of earth covered the grave, Victoria knelt and placed her wedding ring atop the mound. I have nothing left, she whispered, not even dignity. Elijah stood behind her, uncomfortable with her raw grief yet unable to turn away from it. The setting sun cast long shadows across the homestead, a place that had clearly been built with hope and hard work, now shattered in a single day of violence. Mrs. Thornton, Elijah said, his voice low and firm as she rose to her feet, I promise you this, you'll never beg again, not while I draw breath. The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise her. They were a commitment he had no business making, a promise he wasn't certain he could keep. Yet as Victoria's tearful gaze met his, Elijah knew he'd spoken a truth he couldn't take back. He had just bound his fate to that of a widow he'd known for less than 2 hours, and in doing so, challenged everything he believed about survival on the frontier. They rode double on Elijah's mare until reaching the small settlement of Willow Creek just before midnight. The town consisted of little more than a general store, a saloon, and a handful of buildings huddled against the wilderness. Elijah helped Victoria dismount outside a modest 2-story structure with a sign reading Willow Creek Hotel and Boarding House. The night clerk, an elderly man with spectacles perched on his nose, raised his eyebrows at the sight of Victoria's disheveled appearance and Elijah's grim expression. Room for the lady, Elijah said, placing coins on the counter, and information if you have it. Information costs extra, the clerk replied, eyeing the money. I'm looking for 3 men, one has a scar across his cheek. They might have come through here today. The clerk pocketed the coins before answering. Hayes and his boys were in the saloon earlier, flashing more money than usual, left about 3 hours ago, headed east toward Millerville. Victoria's sharp intake of breath confirmed Elijah's suspicion. He placed more coins on the counter. The lady needs a hot bath, clean clothes, and meals. This should cover a week's stay. Elijah, Victoria protested weakly. You can't. I can and I will, he interrupted. Rest, recover. I'll return in a few days. You're going after them? Her voice trembled. Elijah nodded once, his expression unreadable. Those men need to answer for what they've done. You'll get yourself killed, she whispered. Perhaps, he acknowledged. But I gave my word. Victoria suddenly reached out, gripping his arm with surprising strength. Why risk your life for a stranger's widow? Elijah found himself unable to meet her intense gaze. Get some rest, Mrs. Thornton. You've had a difficult day. Before she could protest further, he turned and walked out, leaving Victoria standing in the hotel lobby clutching the small bundle of possessions she'd managed to salvage from her destroyed home. Outside, Elijah leaned against the hitching post and drew a deep breath of the cool night air. What was he doing? This woman's tragedy wasn't his concern. The frontier was full of victims and he couldn't save them all. He'd long ago accepted that the West was no place for justice or sentiment, only survival, yet he found himself unable to ride away. The image of Victoria's tear-stained face kept him rooted in place, challenging beliefs he'd held since watching his family's farm burn during the war. Perhaps it was time to prove that one man could make a difference, even in this lawless territory. With renewed determination, Elijah mounted his horse and headed toward the local sheriff's office. If he was going after Hayes and his gang, he'd need more information, and perhaps, for once, the law on his side. 3 days of hard riding brought Elijah to the outskirts of Millerville, a growing settlement near the railroad. According to the sheriff in Willow Creek, Hayes and his gang frequently sold stolen goods to a fence operating out of the back room of Millerville's largest saloon. Elijah approached cautiously, leaving his horse at a livery stable and proceeding on foot. He'd replaced his trail-worn clothes with a clean shirt and vest, attempting to blend in with the townsfolk rather than announce himself as a cowhand. The weight of his revolver against his hip provided his only comfort as he pushed through the batwing doors of the Iron Horse Saloon. The establishment was crowded despite the early hour, filled with the usual mix of miners, railroad men, and drifters seeking refuge from the afternoon heat. Elijah ordered a whiskey and leaned against the bar, scanning the room with practiced casualness. It didn't take long to spot his quarry. Hayes sat at a corner table, his scarred face twisted in laughter as he dealt cards to his companions. The three men had the easy confidence of those who believed themselves untouchable, and in many ways they were. The law was spread thin, and most folks knew better than to challenge men who killed without conscience. Elijah recognized the other two from descriptions Victoria had provided, a lanky man with a drooping mustache and a heavy-set fellow wearing a stained buckskin jacket. All three wore pistols low on their hips, ready for trouble. As Elijah watched, Hayes stood and moved toward a door at the rear of the saloon, likely heading to meet the fence. This might be Elijah's only chance to catch the man alone. Setting down his barely touched whiskey, Elijah moved casually through the crowd, timing his approach to intercept Hayes in the narrow hallway leading to the back rooms. "Hayes," Elijah said quietly as they met in the dim corridor. The scarred man's hand instantly moved toward his gun. "Do I know you, friend?" "You know a woman named Victoria Thornton," Elijah replied, keeping his own hands visible. "You killed her husband 3 days ago." Recognition flickered in Hayes' eyes, followed by cold amusement. "The pretty blonde, she sent you to avenge her man," he chuckled. "Waste of a good life, yours and his. That homestead was ripe for picking." "You have a choice," Elijah said, his voice steady despite the rage building inside him. "Return what you stole and face a judge in Willow Creek, or—" Hayes laughed outright. "Or what, cowboy, you'll shoot me." "In a crowded saloon with my boys 20 feet away," he leaned closer. "That woman begged real pretty for her husband's life. Maybe I'll pay her another visit, show her what happens to widows who don't know when to quit." Something snapped inside Elijah, a restraint he'd maintained for years, a belief that violence only begot more violence. In one fluid motion, he grabbed Hayes by the shirt front and slammed him against the wall, pressing his forearm against the outlaw's throat. "You won't go near her again," he growled. Hayes' eyes widened in genuine surprise at the sudden attack, but his shock quickly turned to malicious glee. "Boys," he called out hoarsely, "got a hero back here." The sound of chairs scraping against the floor told Elijah he had moments before the confrontation escalated. He released Hayes with a shove and backed toward the rear exit, his hand hovering near his weapon. "This isn't over," he promised as the outlaw's companions appeared at the end of the hallway. "It will be soon enough," Hayes sneered, rubbing his throat. "Vance Decker, our blonde widow, sent a guardian angel. Let's clip his wings." Elijah pushed through the back door into an alley just as the first shot splintered the doorframe above his head. He ran, zigzagging between buildings as more bullets kicked up dust at his heels. He'd made a critical error. Confronting 3 armed men with nothing but righteous anger was a fool's errand, not a strategy. By the time he reached his horse at the livery, Elijah had formulated a new plan. He couldn't take all 3 men in a straight fight, but he could track them to their hideout and await a better opportunity. If they were typical of their kind, they'd celebrate their apparent victory with whiskey, and whiskey made men careless. As he rode out of Millerville, Elijah realized with grim amusement that he'd just risked his life for a woman he barely knew. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent years avoiding attachment, only to find himself bound by a hasty promise to a grieving widow. "You're a damned fool, Quinn," he muttered to himself as he found a vantage point overlooking the town. "A damned fool indeed." Victoria sat on the edge of the narrow bed in her boarding house room, staring at her reflection in the small mirror on the dresser. 4 days had passed since Elijah Quinn had ridden out of Willow Creek, and with each passing day, her concern for his safety had grown alongside her bewilderment at his actions. Why would a stranger risk so much for her? In her 22 years, Victoria had learned that kindness usually came with expectations attached. Yet Elijah had asked for nothing in return for his help, not even her gratitude. The bruise on her jaw had faded to a yellowish shadow, and her golden hair was neatly arranged in a simple bun. The boarding house owner, a kindly widow named Mrs. Beeman, had provided her with a serviceable blue dress to replace her torn clothing. Outwardly, she appeared to be recovering from her ordeal, but inside, Victoria felt adrift. She had married Charles Thornton at 18, more out of practical necessity than passionate love. He had been a good man, steady, hardworking, determined to build a life in the territory, but their relationship had been one of comfortable companionship rather than deep affection. His death had left her not only grieving but facing the harsh reality of a woman alone on the frontier. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Mrs. Thornton," Mrs. Beeman's voice called. "There's someone asking after you downstairs." Victoria's heart leaped with unexpected hope. "Elijah." "No, dear, a gentleman from the bank says he needs to discuss your husband's affairs." The hope collapsed into dread. Victoria had been avoiding thinking about her financial situation, but reality couldn't be postponed forever. She smoothed her dress and followed Mrs. Beeman downstairs to the small sitting room. The bank representative, a thin man with a precisely trimmed mustache, stood as she entered. "Mrs. Thornton, I'm Gerald Lansing from the Territorial Bank of Montana. Please accept my condolences for your loss." Victoria nodded stiffly. "Thank you, Mr. Lansing. I understand your homestead was attacked." He consulted a small notebook. "Most unfortunate. However, I must inform you that your husband's loan on the property remains outstanding. The bank requires payment or will be forced to reclaim the land." "But everything was stolen," Victoria protested. "The cattle, our savings, all of it." Lansing's expression remained impassive. "The bank sympathizes with your situation, Mrs. Thornton, but business is business. You have 30 days to settle the debt before foreclosure proceedings begin." 30 days, that's impossible. How am I supposed to? Perhaps you have family who could assist, or another arrangement could be made. His eyes traveled over her in a way that made his meaning perfectly clear. Victoria straightened her spine, anger displacing shock. "Get out." "I beg your pardon. I said get out. I will find a way to pay the bank what it's owed, but not through any arrangement with you." Lansing's face hardened. "Pride is a luxury for those who can afford it, Mrs. Thornton. I'll return in 30 days. Consider your options carefully until then." With a curt nod, he departed, leaving Victoria trembling with a mixture of rage and despair. Mrs. Beeman, who had remained discreetly in the doorway, clicked her tongue in disapproval. "That man has made similar offers to other widows. Pay him no mind, dear." "But he's right about one thing," Victoria said quietly. "I have no way to pay the loan. Everything we built is gone." "Perhaps your cowboy will return with good news," the older woman suggested kindly. "He's not my cowboy," Victoria corrected automatically, though the words stirred something unexpected within her. In truth, she'd thought of little else but Elijah Quinn's intense blue eyes and the solemn promise he'd made beside her husband's grave. Yet even if he managed to recover some of what was stolen, would it be enough? And what would happen afterward? Elijah struck her as a man unaccustomed to staying in one place for long. The thought of his inevitable departure left her with an emptiness she couldn't explain, especially when her husband's body was barely cold in the ground. That evening, as Victoria helped Mrs. Beeman prepare dinner for the boarders, the older woman shared gossip gleaned from travelers passing through Willow Creek. "They say Hayes and his gang were seen heading toward the old mining camp at Bear Creek," Mrs. Beeman said as she rolled out biscuit dough. "Apparently they had some trouble in Millerville, got into a gunfight with a lone stranger." Victoria nearly dropped the pot she was stirring. a stranger. Did they describe him? Tall, handsome young fellow, they said, confronted Hayes right in the Iron Horse Saloon before being chased out of town. Mrs. Beeman glanced at Victoria's pale face. You think it was your Mr. Quinn? He's not my, Victoria began automatically before cutting herself off. Yes, it sounds like him. Is he, did they say if he was hurt? No mention of that. Just that he escaped with Hayes and his boys in pursuit. The older woman patted Victoria's arm reassuringly. Your young man sounds capable enough to handle himself. Victoria turned back to the stove to hide her conflicted expression. Why did the thought of Elijah facing 3 killers alone fill her with such dread? She hardly knew him. Yet in the brief time they'd spent together, he'd shown her more consideration than most men she'd known her entire life. That night, Victoria knelt beside her bed to pray, not just for Charles's soul as she had the previous nights, but for Elijah's safety. As she did, she realized with a start that she could barely recall her husband's face, while Elijah's remained vivid in her mind. The realization brought a wave of guilt that kept her awake long into the night. Elijah crouched in the underbrush, watching as Hayes and his men made camp in the remains of the abandoned mining settlement at Bear Creek. He'd been tracking them for 2 days, waiting for the right moment to strike. The outlaw trio had grown increasingly careless, confident they'd left any pursuit behind in Millerville. Darkness was falling rapidly and a spring storm was brewing to the west. Perfect conditions for what Elijah had planned. He checked his weapons one final time, revolver, hunting knife, and a shotgun borrowed from a sympathetic rancher whose property Hayes had previously raided. The weight of the weapons reminded him of war years he'd tried to forget, of skills he'd hoped never to use again. Elijah had avoided violence since returning from the conflict that tore the nation apart. He'd seen enough bloodshed to last several lifetimes and had vowed never to be the cause of more. Yet here he was, preparing to confront 3 killers for the sake of a woman he barely knew. Victoria's face appeared unbidden in his mind, not tearful and frightened as when he'd found her, but as she'd looked when saying goodbye at the hotel, her green eyes filled with a complexity of emotions he couldn't decipher. What was it about this woman that had broken through years of carefully maintained indifference? A crack of thunder pulled Elijah from his thoughts. The storm was moving in faster than expected. He needed to act now while rain and darkness would provide cover. The outlaws had taken shelter in the largest remaining structure in the ghost town, an old assier's office with stone walls and a partially collapsed roof. Through the glassless windows, Elijah could see the glow of their fire and hear their drunken laughter. They were celebrating, unaware that justice had followed them into the wilderness. Moving silently through the gathering darkness, Elijah positioned himself near the building's only door. The first heavy raindrops began to fall as he prepared to make his move. Hayes, he called out, his voice nearly drowned by a peal of thunder. Come out and face me. Silence fell inside the building, followed by hurried movement and the metallic sound of weapons being readied. Who's out there? Hayes's voice finally responded, tension evident despite his attempt at bravado. You know who. I've come for what you stole from the Thornton homestead. Coarse laughter followed. The hero returns. Thought we'd seen the last of you in Millerville. I made a promise to Mrs. Thornton, Elijah replied steadily. I intend to keep it. A shot rang out, splintering the wooden door frame inches from where Elijah stood. That's my answer, cowboy, Hayes called. Come and get us if you're man enough. Elijah had expected no less. These were men who understood only violence, who respected only power. Reasoning with them had been a formality, not a genuine attempt at resolution. The rain began falling in earnest now, a driving downpour that would make visibility poor for everyone. Using the storm as cover, Elijah circled the building toward a section of collapsed roof he'd noted earlier. The outlaws would be watching the door, not expecting an attack from above. Lightning split the sky as Elijah carefully climbed the rough stone wall. The illumination was momentary but sufficient to confirm his path. Reaching the partially caved-in roof, he peered through the gap into the room below. Hayes and his men had positioned themselves with a clear view of the door, weapons trained on the entrance. They were so focused on the expected frontal attack that they failed to notice the dark figure above them. Elijah dropped through the opening, landing behind a stack of rotting crates. The noise was lost in another thunderclap. From his new position, he could see what he'd come for: Victoria's possessions piled carelessly in the corner. A silver-framed photograph, jewelry, and a small lockbox that likely contained the homestead savings. "He's bluffing," the heavy-set outlaw in the buckskin jacket was saying. "One man against three. He'd be a fool." "Maybe," Hayes replied, his scarred face illuminated by flickering firelight, "but he seemed mighty concerned about that widow. Men do foolish things for a pretty face." The third man spat into the fire. "Should have taken her with us when we had the chance, could have had some fun before." He never finished the sentence. Elijah's shotgun blast caught him squarely in the chest, throwing him backward against the far wall. Before the echoes faded, Elijah had rolled to a new position, narrowly avoiding the panicked shots from the two remaining outlaws. "Where is he?" Hayes shouted, firing blindly into the shadows. Elijah didn't answer. Instead, he moved silently along the wall, working his way behind the buckskin-clad outlaw. When lightning flashed again, illuminating the interior of the building, Elijah was ready. His revolver barked twice and the second man crumpled to the floor. Now only Hayes remained. The outlaw leader had overturned a heavy table for cover and was reloading frantically. "Just you and me now," Elijah called, his voice echoing in the stone building. "Who are you?" Hayes demanded, genuine fear creeping into his voice. "Why risk your life for some woman's trinkets?" "Because I gave my word," Elijah answered simply, "and out here that still means something to some of us." Lightning flashed again, and in that instant, both men fired. Elijah felt the burn of a bullet grazing his left arm but maintained his focus. His own shot found its mark. Hayes staggered backward, clutching his shoulder, his gun clattering to the floor. "Finish it then," the outlaw gasped as Elijah approached, weapon still trained on him. "Be a man and finish what you started." Elijah considered the wounded man before him. It would be easy, justifiable even, to end Hayes's life. The outlaw had murdered without remorse and would likely continue to do so if allowed to live. Yet as his finger tensed on the trigger, Victoria's face appeared in Elijah's mind once more. Not as a motivation for vengeance, but as a reminder of something he'd nearly forgotten, that even in this harsh land, humanity still mattered. That survival alone wasn't enough reason to live. "I'm not like you," Elijah said finally, lowering his gun slightly. "You'll stand trial for what you did." Hayes's eyes narrowed. "You're a fool the moment you turn your back." With a sudden motion, the outlaw reached for a knife in his boot. Elijah's reaction was instinctive, a single shot that found its mark with deadly accuracy. As Hayes slumped to the floor, Elijah felt no satisfaction, only a weariness that settled deep in his bones. He'd come seeking justice and found only more death, a cycle he'd hoped to leave behind after the war. Outside, the storm began to subside. Elijah gathered Victoria's possessions and what remained of her savings. It wasn't everything the outlaws had stolen, they'd clearly already spent or traded some of it, but it would be enough to give her a chance at a fresh start. As dawn broke over the abandoned mining camp, Elijah rode away with a conflicted heart. He had fulfilled his promise, but at a cost he hadn't anticipated. 3 more deaths on his conscience and a growing attachment to a woman he had no right to think about. Victoria deserved a good man, someone untouched by the violence that had shaped Elijah's life, someone who could offer her more than nightmares and guilt. The best thing he could do was return what belonged to her and then ride away, leaving her to build a new life without the shadow of his past darkening her future. Yet with each mile that brought him closer to Willow Creek, Elijah found it increasingly difficult to imagine riding away from those green eyes that had somehow breached the walls around his heart. The bell above the general store door jingled as Victoria entered, nodding politely to Mrs. Henderson behind the counter. After a week in Willow Creek, she had become familiar with the small settlement's residents, many of whom had shown her unexpected kindness since learning of her circumstances. "Good morning, Mrs. Thornton," the shopkeeper greeted her warmly. "How are you faring today?" "As well as can be expected, thank you," Victoria replied with the practiced smile she'd developed for such inquiries. The truth that she woke each night from nightmares of her husband's murder and spent each day anxiously watching the road for a cowboy who might never return remained private. "Any word from your friend, Mrs. Henderson asked, intuitive as always. Victoria shook her head. "Not yet." The older woman patted her hand sympathetically. Men like that always return, dear. The question is whether they stay. The observation struck uncomfortably close to Victoria's unacknowledged fears. Even if Elijah did come back, what then? She had no claim on him beyond a promise made in a moment of compassion. And despite the confusing emotions his memory stirred in her, Victoria wasn't certain she was ready to examine them too closely. Her husband was barely in his grave, and propriety demanded a period of mourning regardless of the circumstances. "I've come about the position," Victoria said, changing the subject. "Mrs. Beeman mentioned you needed help in the store." Mrs. Henderson's expression softened. "Indeed we do. My arthritis makes unpacking shipments difficult these days. The pay isn't much, but—" "It would be most welcome," Victoria interjected sincerely. Her remaining funds would barely last another week, and the bank's deadline loomed ever closer. As they discussed the details of the position, the bell above the door jingled again. Victoria didn't turn until she noticed Mrs. Henderson's eyes widen in surprise. "Well, speak of the devil," the shopkeeper murmured. Victoria's heart leaped into her throat as she turned to find Elijah Quinn standing in the doorway, travel-worn and weary but undeniably alive. His blue eyes found hers immediately, and something in their depths made her breath catch. "Mrs. Thornton," he said, removing his hat, "I've brought what I could recover." It took Victoria a moment to notice the saddlebags slung over his shoulder and the small bundle in his hands. She recognized the silver-framed photograph of her wedding day and the lockbox that had contained their savings. "You found them," she whispered, hardly believing the evidence before her eyes. "You actually found them." "If you'll excuse us, Mrs. Henderson," Elijah said politely to the shopkeeper, who was watching the exchange with undisguised fascination. Of course," the woman replied, making a poor show of suddenly needing to organize items on a distant shelf. Elijah guided Victoria to a quiet corner of the store. "It's not everything," he said quietly. They'd already spent or traded some of it, but the cash in the lockbox and these few valuables should help you start over. Victoria opened the box with trembling fingers, finding nearly 2/3 of their savings intact. It wasn't enough to pay off the homestead loan entirely, but it would buy her time to find a solution. "How did you—" she began, then noticed the blood-stained bandage visible beneath his rolled-up sleeve. "You're hurt." Elijah shrugged dismissively. "It's nothing, a scratch." "And Hayes, his men. They won't trouble anyone again." The simple statement contained volumes. Victoria studied Elijah's face, noting new lines of weariness around his eyes and mouth. He had killed for her, or at least for his promise to her, and it had clearly taken a toll. "Thank you," she said softly, knowing the words were wholly inadequate. "I never truly believed." "That is, I hoped, but—" "I gave my word," Elijah interrupted, as if that explained everything. An awkward silence fell between them, filled with unasked questions and unspoken emotions. "Will you stay?" Victoria finally asked, surprising herself with her directness. Elijah's expression remained unreadable. "I'm not sure that would be wise, Mrs. Thornton." The formality stung more than it should have. "I see. You deserve better than a wandering cowhand with nothing to his name but a horse and whatever he can fit in his saddlebags," Elijah continued, his gaze dropping to the floor between them. "Perhaps you should let me decide what I deserve," Victoria replied, a hint of steel entering her voice. "At least stay until your arm heals properly. Mrs. Beeman has a spare room." Elijah hesitated, clearly torn between his instinct to ride away and something else, something that kept his boots rooted to the floor of the general store. "1 week," he finally conceded, "then I'll move on." Victoria nodded, hiding her relief and the irrational disappointment that accompanied his conditions. 1 week wasn't much, but it was better than watching him walk out the door and never return. 1 week, she agreed. "Starting after you've seen the doctor." The faintest hint of a smile touched Elijah's lips, the first Victoria had witnessed from him. "Yes, ma'am." As they left the store together, Victoria was acutely aware of the curious gazes following them. Willow Creek was small enough that their arrangement would be the subject of speculation by sundown. For a woman in mourning to be seen with a handsome stranger would raise eyebrows regardless of the circumstances. Yet as Elijah walked beside her down the dusty main street, his presence solid and reassuring, Victoria found she cared less about propriety than she ever had before. The frontier had taken nearly everything from her, her husband, her home, her security. Why should it also take the right to find comfort where she could? The thought was scandalous enough to bring a flush to her cheeks, one that deepened when Elijah's hand briefly, perhaps accidentally, brushed against hers. 1 week, 7 days to convince a solitary cowboy that perhaps there were things worth staying for after all. The week stretched into 2, then 3, as Elijah's wound proved more troublesome than he'd admitted. Infection set in, requiring daily attention from Willow Creek's elderly doctor and confining him to his room at Mrs. Beeman's boarding house. Victoria found herself dividing her time between her new position at the general store and caring for Elijah, bringing meals to his room and changing his bandages when the doctor was occupied elsewhere. Their time together created a peculiar intimacy, a closeness born of shared trauma and mutual need that defied conventional boundaries. They spoke little of the past. Elijah avoided discussing what had happened at Bear Creek, and Victoria rarely mentioned Charles. Instead, their conversations drifted to simpler things: childhood memories, books they'd read, dreams they'd once harbored before the harsh realities of frontier life intervened. "I wanted to be a teacher," Victoria admitted one evening as she changed Elijah's bandage. His fever had finally broken, and color was returning to his previously pallid features. "Before I met Charles, I had plans to take the certification examination in St. Louis." "Why didn't you?" Elijah asked, wincing slightly as she applied fresh ointment to his healing wound. Victoria's hands stilled momentarily. "My father died, leaving significant debts. Charles offered marriage and a fresh start in the territory." She secured the clean bandage before continuing. "He was a good man, kind. Practical." "But you didn't love him," Elijah observed quietly. The statement should have offended her, yet Victoria found herself unable to summon indignation at his perception. "I cared deeply for him," she said carefully. "Love comes in many forms. And did you find it out here on the frontier?" The question hung between them, layered with meanings neither was prepared to articulate. Victoria busied herself gathering the used bandages, avoiding Elijah's intense gaze. "I found purpose," she finally answered, "and for a while that was enough." Elijah's hand caught hers, stilling her nervous movement. "And now?" Victoria looked up, finding his blue eyes searching her face with an openness she hadn't seen before. The moment stretched between them, fragile and charged with possibility. A knock at the door shattered the tension. "Victoria, are you in there?" Mrs. Beeman's voice called. "Mr. Lansing from the bank is downstairs asking to speak with you." Reality crashed back with painful clarity. The bank's deadline was approaching, and despite the recovered savings and her earnings from the store, Victoria was still short of the full amount needed to save the homestead. "Tell him I'll be right down," she replied, reluctantly withdrawing her hand from Elijah's. "I need to go." "Victoria," Elijah said, stopping her at the door. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent an unexpected shiver through her. "What does the bank want with you?" She hesitated, unwilling to burden him with her financial troubles when he was still recovering, just finalizing some matters regarding Charles's accounts. The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but Victoria couldn't bear to see pity in Elijah's eyes, or worse, to have him offer the remainder of whatever money he possessed out of some misplaced sense of obligation. Downstairs, Lansing waited in the small parlor, his expression as coldly efficient as always. "Mrs. Thornton," he greeted her with a perfunctory nod, "I've come to inquire about your intentions regarding the outstanding loan." "The deadline is in 3 days." Victoria straightened her spine, refusing to show weakness before this man. "I have a portion of the amount. If the bank could extend the deadline by another month, I believe I can secure the remainder." Lansing's thin smile held no warmth. "I'm afraid that won't be possible. However, I'm authorized to present an alternative solution." He removed a document from his briefcase. "The bank is prepared to forgive the debt entirely in exchange for the mineral rights to the property." Victoria frowned. "Mineral rights? The land was surveyed before Charles purchased it. There are no valuable minerals there." "Nevertheless, the bank believes there may be potential worth exploring." The offer stands until the deadline. After that, foreclosure proceedings will begin. He placed the document on the table between them. Consider it carefully, Mrs. Thornton. It may be your only option to retain any part of your husband's legacy. After Lansing departed, Victoria remained in the parlor, staring at the document with growing suspicion. Why would the bank want mineral rights to land proven to contain nothing of value? Something wasn't right, but she lacked the knowledge or resources to investigate further. That evening, as Victoria served dinner to the boarding house residents, she overheard a conversation between two railroad surveyors that made her blood run cold. "The line's definitely coming through north of Willow Creek," one was saying. "Surveys complete, and they're buying up properties along the route." "Any holdouts?" his companion asked. "A few, but most folks jump at the money once they hear the railroad's coming. Land values triple overnight when the stations are announced." Victoria nearly dropped the plate she was carrying. The Thornton homestead lay directly in the path the surveyors were describing. The bank didn't want the mineral rights, they wanted control of land that was about to become extremely valuable. She excused herself and hurried upstairs, her mind racing. If she signed away the mineral rights, she'd essentially be surrendering the most valuable aspect of the property for nothing. But without the full loan payment, she'd lose everything in 3 days regardless. Victoria hesitated outside Elijah's door, torn between pride and necessity. He was healing well and had already spoken of moving on soon. Whatever momentary connection they'd shared earlier was likely nothing more than the product of his illness and her vulnerability. Yet she needed advice from someone she could trust, and despite the brevity of their acquaintance, Elijah Quinn had proven himself trustworthy in ways that mattered most. Taking a deep breath, Victoria knocked softly on his door. Elijah listened intently as Victoria explained the situation, his expression growing darker with each detail she shared. "It's fraud," he said when she finished. "They're deliberately misleading you to acquire valuable property for pennies on the dollar." Victoria sank onto the chair beside his bed, the weight of the deception making her feel physically ill. "What can I do? I don't have enough to pay the loan, and the deadline is in 3 days." Elijah was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant as he considered the problem. "How much are you short?" $200, she admitted reluctantly, nearly half the original amount. Another lengthy silence followed, during which Victoria could almost see him calculating possibilities behind those intense blue eyes. "I have some money," he finally said. "Not much, but—" "No," Victoria interrupted firmly. "I didn't come here to ask for your money, Elijah. You've already done more than enough." "Then why did you come?" he asked quietly. The question caught her off guard. Why had she sought him out? Not just for advice, Mrs. Beeman or the sheriff could have provided that. There was something more, something she wasn't ready to acknowledge even to herself. "Because I trust you," she said simply. Elijah's expression softened in a way she'd never seen before. "Then trust me now, let me help you keep your land." "It's not my land," Victoria protested weakly. "It was Charles's dream, not mine. I never wanted to be a farmer's wife." "Then what do you want, Victoria?" The directness of his question made her breath catch. What did she want? Security, certainly, independence. Perhaps even the teaching position she'd once dreamed of. But as she looked at Elijah, truly looked at him, seeing the man behind the stoic facade, Victoria realized that what she wanted most had changed. "I want a choice," she finally answered. "Not decisions forced upon me by circumstance or necessity. Just once I want to choose my own path." Elijah nodded slowly, understanding darkening his eyes. "Then we'll make sure you have one." The next morning, Elijah rose earlier than usual, dressed carefully, and made his way to the small building that housed Willow Creek's telegraph office. His arm still ached, but the worst of the infection had passed, leaving him with renewed strength and purpose. The operator looked up in surprise as Elijah entered. "Help you, Quinn." "Need to send a wire," Elijah replied, sliding a piece of paper across the counter. "To Denver, it's urgent." The operator raised his eyebrows as he read the message. "This'll cost you extra, rush delivery." "I know," Elijah counted out the coins without hesitation. "Send it immediately." Later that day, Victoria returned from her shift at the general store to find Elijah waiting on the boarding house porch, looking more like himself than he had since his injury. He'd shaved and his clothes were freshly pressed, giving him an almost respectable appearance despite the worn hat that still shadowed his features. "You're up," she observed, pleasure warming her voice. The doctor said. "I need to show you something," Elijah interrupted, offering his arm. "Will you walk with me?" Curious, Victoria placed her hand on his arm, noticing how he carefully positioned himself to protect his healing wound. Together they strolled down Willow Creek's main street, drawing curious glances from townspeople unaccustomed to seeing the young widow and the mysterious cowboy openly together. "People are staring," Victoria murmured, suddenly self-conscious. "Let them," Elijah replied simply. "You have nothing to be ashamed of." They stopped outside the telegraph office where the operator waved Elijah inside. "Just came through, Quinn. Must have friends in high places to get a response this quick." Elijah accepted the yellow paper, reading it quickly before a rare smile spread across his face. "Thank you, Jenkins." Outside again, he handed the telegram to Victoria. "Read it." She scanned the brief message, confusion giving way to astonishment as she grasped its meaning. QUINN Stop Railroad Commission, CONFIRMS Route through Thornton Property Stop Purchasing Agent ARIVING, WLOW Series K Next Week Stop, Advise Widow Hold Firm Stop Fair Market Value Minimum $10,000 Stop Railroad AT2RNYS Investigating Bank Fraud ALLEGATIONS Stop REGARDS Marshall QUINN Stop. "Marshall Quinn," Victoria looked up questioningly. Elijah shifted uncomfortably. "My older brother, he works for the Department of Justice in Denver, specializes in railroad matters." "You never mentioned a brother." "There are many things I haven't mentioned," Elijah admitted. "The war. It separated us in more ways than one." Victoria studied his face, sensing there was much more to that simple statement than he was revealing, and he responded to your wire this quickly. "Family is family even when paths diverge," Elijah gestured to the telegram. "The important part is that the Railroad Commission has confirmed what you suspected. Your land is valuable, far more valuable than the bank is admitting." Victoria reread the telegram, the implications slowly sinking in. $10,000, that's enough to pay off the loan and start fresh wherever you choose, Elijah finished for her, whether that's here or elsewhere. The possibility of such freedom was almost too much to comprehend. Victoria had been living day to day, struggling to survive since Charles's death. The thought of having options, of truly being able to choose her path, was overwhelming. "What do I do now?" she asked, still dazed by this sudden reversal of fortune. "Tomorrow, you go to the bank and request an extension based on pending negotiations with the railroad," Elijah explained. "My brother's telegram gives you leverage. Lansing will have to agree or risk exposing the bank's attempted fraud." Victoria's mind raced with possibilities. With such resources, she could pay off the loan, sell the property to the railroad at a fair price, and still have more than enough to establish herself anywhere she chose. She could finally pursue the teaching career she'd abandoned, perhaps even in a larger town with an established school. Yet as she looked at Elijah, this man who had risked his life to help her, who had stayed when every instinct likely told him to move on, Victoria realized that her dreams had shifted. The future she now envisioned wasn't one of solitary independence but something altogether more frightening and exhilarating. "And what will you do," she asked softly, "when this is settled?" Elijah's expression grew guarded. "I should move on. The spring roundup will be starting soon. Work to be found for a man who knows cattle." "Is that what you want?" The question hung between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities. For a moment Victoria thought he wouldn't answer, that the walls he'd built around himself were too thick to breach. "What I want," Elijah finally said, his voice low and intent, "hasn't mattered for a very long time." Victoria found herself taking a step closer, close enough to see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes. "It matters to me." Before either could say more, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. 3 riders were coming down the main street, led by a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit. They reined in outside the hotel, drawing curious onlookers. "The railroad men," Victoria murmured. "They've come earlier than your brother said." Elijah frowned. "Something's not right." "Stay here." He moved toward the newcomers, his posture alerting Victoria to his suspicion. She followed despite his instruction, unwilling to be left behind in matters that concerned her future. The well-dressed man was speaking to the gathered townsfolk, representing the Northern Pacific Railroad Company. "We're surveying potential routes through this region and acquiring necessary properties." "Mr. Lansing mentioned you wouldn't arrive until next week," Elijah interrupted, his voice carrying across the street. The man turned, assessing Elijah with cool professionalism. "I'm afraid I don't know any Mr. Lansing. I'm Jonathan Hargrove, Chief Purchasing Agent for the Northern Pacific, and you are?" "Elijah Quinn. I'm inquiring on behalf of Mrs. Victoria Thornton, whose property lies north of town." Recognition flickered in Hargrove's eyes. "Ah, yes, the Thornton homestead is indeed on our planned route. I was planning to call on Mrs. Thornton tomorrow to discuss acquisition terms." Victoria stepped forward. "I'm Mrs. Thornton, Mr. Hargrove, and I believe there may be some confusion regarding my property." As Victoria explained the situation with the bank, Hargrove's expression darkened. "This is most disturbing, Mrs. Thornton. The railroad does not condone such practices. In fact, we pride ourselves on fair dealing with landowners." "Then you're not working with the bank to acquire my property cheaply," Victoria pressed. "Absolutely not. We pay fair market value for all acquisitions, especially those directly on planned routes." Hargrove removed a notebook from his jacket. "In fact, our preliminary valuation of your property, given its location and potential for a water station, is considerably higher than typical homesteads." The figure he named matched what Elijah's brother had indicated, a sum that would not only clear her debts but provide security for years to come. "The bank has given me until tomorrow to settle my husband's loan," Victoria explained. "After that, they intend to claim the property." Hargrove straightened his already impeccable jacket. "Perhaps I should pay Mr. Lansing a visit this afternoon. The railroad has considerable influence, Mrs. Thornton, and we take a very dim view of financial institutions attempting to interfere with our negotiations." As Hargrove and his companions headed toward the bank, Victoria turned to Elijah, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "It seems your brother was right." "Marshall usually is," Elijah replied with a hint of a smile. "It was always the most annoying thing about him." Victoria laughed, a sound of pure relief and joy that caught the attention of passers-by. She didn't care. For the first time since Charles's death, perhaps for the first time in years, she felt truly free, not just financially but emotionally. "I need to think," she said suddenly, "about what comes next. What I truly want." Elijah nodded, his expression unreadable once more. "Of course, you have choices now." As he turned to leave, Victoria caught his arm. "Will you walk with me out by the creek? There's something I'd like to discuss with you." A flicker of uncertainty crossed his features before he nodded. "Lead the way." They walked in comfortable silence through town and along the narrow path that followed Willow Creek upstream. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows across their path. When they reached a small clearing beside the water, Victoria stopped. "When I married Charles," she began without preamble, "it was a practical decision. He needed a wife to help establish his homestead, and I needed security after my father's death left me penniless." She stared out at the flowing water. "There was respect between us and companionship, but not what I believe marriage should be." Elijah remained silent, letting her speak without interruption. "Since you came into my life," Victoria continued, finding courage in his silence, "I've begun to understand what I truly want. Not just security or independence, but connection, real connection with someone who sees me as I am." She turned to face him directly. "The railroads offer means I can go anywhere, do anything. I could move to Denver or even back east, establish myself as a teacher or open a small business." "You deserve that chance," Elijah said softly. "To make your own way." "Yes," Victoria agreed, "but I've realized something else. Making my own way doesn't have to mean making it alone." She took a deep breath. "Unless that's what you want." Elijah's expression shifted, vulnerability breaking through his careful reserve. "What I want," he said slowly, "is something I'd given up hoping for long ago. something I convinced myself wasn't possible for a man like me. And what is that? Victoria asked, her heart hammering in her chest. Instead of answering with words, Elijah closed the distance between them. His hand, calloused from years of rope and reins, gently cupped her cheek. His eyes, usually so guarded, now revealed everything he'd kept hidden, longing, fear, and a hope so fragile it might shatter at a touch. A home, he whispered, not a place, a person. Victoria raised her hand to cover his. Then perhaps we've both found what we're looking for. When his lips met hers, Victoria felt the last walls between them crumble. This wasn't the tepid affection she'd known with Charles, but something altogether wilder and more profound, a connection forged in shared trauma and mutual respect that had somehow blossomed into something neither had expected to find on the frontier. As they walked back toward town hand in hand, the future stretching before them held possibilities neither had dared imagine just weeks before. Victoria knew there would be challenges ahead, whispers about the widow who hadn't mourned long enough, questions about the cowboy with the mysterious past, decisions about where and how to build their life together. But for the first time since she'd come west, Victoria felt truly unafraid. Whatever came next, they would face it together, two souls who had found in each other not just survival, but a reason to truly live. 1 year later. The small church in Willow Creek was filled to capacity, wildflowers adorning every pew and sunlight streaming through the windows. Victoria stood before the mirror in the small anteroom, hardly recognizing the woman who gazed back at her. Her golden hair was arranged in an elegant upswept style, decorated with tiny white blossoms. The wedding dress, ordered specially from Denver, was simpler than fashion dictated but perfect for the occasion, its ivory satin bodice giving way to a modest train. "You look beautiful," Mrs. Beeman declared, adjusting Victoria's veil. "He won't know what hit him." Victoria smiled, a flush of happiness coloring her cheeks. "I still can't quite believe we're here." The past year had transformed her life in ways she could never have imagined. The railroad had purchased the Thornton homestead for an even higher sum than initially offered, once they'd determined it was ideal for a water station. Lansing had been dismissed from the bank after the railroad's investigation revealed multiple instances of attempted fraud. With her newfound financial security, Victoria had opened Willow Creek's first proper school, fulfilling her long-deferred dream of teaching. The small town was growing rapidly with the coming of the railroad, and families were arriving weekly, bringing children eager for education. And Elijah had surprised everyone, perhaps even himself, by putting down roots. He'd purchased land just outside town, and with help from his brother Marshall, established a modest horse breeding operation specializing in quality mounts for the cavalry and stagecoach companies. Their courtship had progressed with deliberate care, mindful of Victoria's recent widowhood and the town's watchful eyes. Yet beneath the propriety lay a deepening connection that neither could deny, a partnership of equals built on shared values and mutual respect, with an undercurrent of passion that made Victoria blush to contemplate. When Elijah had proposed 6 months ago, kneeling beside Willow Creek in the very spot where they'd first acknowledged their feelings, Victoria hadn't hesitated. She knew with absolute certainty that this marriage would be everything her first had not, a union of love rather than convenience. A knock at the door interrupted her reflections. "It's time," called the pastor's wife. Victoria took a deep breath, smoothing her dress with suddenly trembling hands. "Ready?" Mrs. Beeman asked gently. "More than ready," Victoria replied with a certainty that dispelled her nervousness. As the church doors opened and the small orchestra began playing, Victoria began her walk down the aisle alone. She had no family to give her away, but that seemed fitting somehow. She was making this choice entirely for herself, freely giving her heart to the man who waited for her at the altar. Elijah stood tall and handsome in a new black suit, his usually wind-blown hair neatly combed, his face clean-shaven for the occasion. Yet it was his expression that caught Victoria's breath, a look of such wonder and devotion that tears pricked at her eyes. Beside him stood his brother Marshall, so similar in appearance yet so different in bearing, the respected lawman alongside the former drifter, both Quinn brothers united again after years of separation. As Victoria reached Elijah's side and placed her hand in his, she remembered their first meeting, a broken woman clutching a kitchen knife, and a solitary cowboy who had made a promise he fully intended to keep. "You're so beautiful," Elijah whispered, his voice rough with emotion. The pastor began the ceremony, his words washing over Victoria as she stood transfixed by the man before her. When the time came for their vows, Elijah's strong voice carried clearly through the church. "I, Elijah James Quinn, take you, Victoria Ann Thornton, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to cherish and respect you, to offer my strength when you need it and accept your strength when I falter. I vow to build a life with you founded on trust and equal partnership." His voice deepened with emotion as he continued. "And I promise you'll never face this world alone again, not its hardships nor its joys, for as long as I draw breath." Tears flowed freely down Victoria's cheeks as she spoke her own vows, sealing their commitment before the community that had become their home. When the pastor finally pronounced them husband and wife, Elijah drew Victoria into an embrace that spoke of both tenderness and passion, their first kiss as a married couple greeted by cheers from the assembled guests. The celebration afterward spilled from the church into the town square, where tables groaned with food contributed by every household in Willow Creek. Children ran laughing between the adults, and even the most reserved townspeople joined in the dancing when the fiddlers struck up lively tunes. As evening approached, Elijah found Victoria sitting slightly apart from the festivities, watching the community celebrate with a contented smile. "Mrs. Quinn," he said, offering his hand. "May I have this dance?" Victoria's heart still fluttered at the new name, a name she had chosen freely, with love rather than necessity. "You may indeed, Mr. Quinn." As they moved together to the music, Elijah held her closer than propriety strictly allowed, his lips near her ear. "Happy." Victoria looked up at the man who had transformed her understanding of what love could be, the cowboy who had found her in tears and offered not just rescue but partnership, not just protection but respect. "Completely," she answered, rising on tiptoe to kiss him softly. "And you?" Elijah's smile, once so rare, now increasingly frequent, illuminated his handsome features. "I never knew it was possible to be this happy." As darkness fell and lanterns were lit around the square, casting a golden glow over the continuing celebration, Victoria leaned her head against Elijah's shoulder. Together they had found something precious on the frontier, not just survival or success but genuine connection. A home not built of timber and nails but of shared dreams and mutual trust. And as they slipped away from the celebration toward their new life together, Victoria knew with absolute certainty that she would indeed never beg again. Not for security, not for respect, not for love. All these things and more now belonged to her by right, freely given and joyfully received in equal measure. The Montana Territory might still be wild and unpredictable, the future filled with challenges they could not yet foresee. But whatever came, they would face it as they had faced everything since that fateful day when a solitary cowboy found a widow in tears, together, stronger for their union than either could ever be alone.